Elsa and Wasatale. Welcome back to the Frithstead Fireside, Sedish podcast. I'm Folcweard, and this is episode 6, Unity and Sedish Belief. I spend a lot of time thinking, about this postmodern world that we live in. And so much of it really just feels like a fog. It just feels like man, this can't be real. But it is. It's just the way that reality hits you sometimes. You're going about your life and then you just stop and you look around and it almost feels like you're in a dream, but you know that you're not, or at least hope you're not. But it's it can be a heavy gray, uh, you know, soul crushing at times. Just the materialism that is everywhere that's just surrounding us, and yeah, that materialism, it wants to constantly tell you that you don't belong, that you don't come from anywhere, that you have no roots and no home. It pushes a fragmentation at every level, and it tries to turn us into isolated consumers who just work, consume, work, consume, and then eventually just disappear. And our folk, our people, we truly are at a crossroads. The choices that we make now really truly are going to echo for generations. But the real question is not merely whether we survive, but are we going to take our folk and our ways and revive? Are we going to be able to continue on and thrive? you know Literally right now, when you look at the big picture, we're facing the shadow of extinction. It's not just physical, but cultural and spiritual. And in this postmodern world that we're living in, we're losing the bonds that hold us together. And so really now, more than ever, now is the time to wake up and to see through that fog, to wake up from that dream, to just come alive and do something. But before going, any further, with the title of this episode being as such, Unity and Sedish Belief, I want to be clear and repeat what it means when I say Sedish or Sedian. Because this is not a word that we just pull out of thin air. It comes from the roots of the Old English Sidu and the Old Norse Sither, which just means the way or the custom. So when I speak of Sedish belief or Sedianism, I'm speaking about our ancient way of life as it's lived today. Our native culture and native religion, but reconstructed and made alive for the world that we actually live in today. Because we're not recreating and trying to be like the 10th century. No, we live today, and so that it must be fit for the world that we're in. And but it's not merely a tradition on surface level, like in the shallow sense, if you will. It really is a lifeline. It is a means by which we reconnect to our gods and our ancestors and our folk. It's the inheritance that modernity, um, foreign influence, and really spiritual confusion has tried to bury, but it wasn't destroyed. That inheritance is still here, and the task before us is to recover it, to preserve it, and then to hand it on. It's not easy. It's a growing process. And we make a lot of mistakes along the way, and we learn things, and then we have to find out, oh, well, okay, I was wrong on that. And then, but you fix it, you learn from it, and you grow. And that is our task. We have to recover it and preserve it and fight for it in order to hand it to those who are with us now, and hand it to those who come after us. But to understand why unity matters, we first have to understand what was broken. Okay, so imagine our faith as like an iron chain. Okay, and it's stretching back all the way back to the gods through countless generations of our ancestors. But at a certain point, uh, a foreign and alien creed and traditions, it came in like bolt cutters and severed that chain. And what followed was not just conversion, but dislocation, if you will. We were left with broken pieces in our hands of that chain, and then until over time, many forgot that that chain has even existed at all. And we know this. For those of us who do follow the faith, you look around, and it's like 99.99% of the people that we encounter in our daily lives have no knowledge of this. And it's because that those bolt cutters just severed that chain, and then we've become as a whole a people with amnesia. And for those of us who do know, where we do feel that calling, and we can able to tap into it, that's where we're rebuilding things, and we're able to bring this to our folk. Now, for the last few decades. Now, this is where I'm going to get into some things, and it might be a little polarizing. It may very well be a thing where you hear what I'm going to be saying, and you're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. And there may not be any middle ground with it, but just bear with me and hear me out. I mean well, but I just have to be honest. So for the last couple few decades, many have tried to repair that break, and it was through what we call ancestral. Okay, so but to be fair, I'm very thankful that ancestral helped bring our native religion back into public view. But let's be honest, ancestral has become a double-edged sword, and it has turned into an umbrella term that's so broad and unstable that it now houses everything. It could be someone could say that they're also true, but yet they're holding liberal universalist theology, or someone else can say they're also true, and it's really just belonging to a racialist political club. Then there's those that we call prison true, just distorted versions of the faith that have come out of the prison system, or even just lackadaisical aesthetic performances that's just masquerade as piety. A lot of that stuff is what we call LARP, right? um, but there's really no, and it's like that because there's no foundation, and so every whim of the imagination has become what way too many just call us a true. So like I said, I give much credit because it brought our faith and our ancestral ways to into the public eye. So that's wonderful, and I think that's great. But it's kind of morphed and turned into an uncontrollable monster, if you will. So, okay. On one side, in trying to include everything, right? It dilutes and it erases the actual inheritance of our ancestors. But on the other, when it swings too far into reaction and exclusion, and then it becomes little more than just a political echo chamber, just dressed in Viking costumes, you know, and but with the absence of standards, um, legitimacy, and theological grounding, people will fill that void with guesswork. They'll fill it with personality cults, and they'll fill it with whatever happens to sound good at the moment. And we can look at that in our own lives where, you can have an idea in your mind and it's like you're convinced this is great, but then it may not manifest into greatness, and or time will pass, and then you learn things and you grow, and then you can look back and you're like, yeah, that wasn't too good, was it? So it's understandable. That's the human condition, right? But those things, that's not enough. And it was never enough, because we can't afford to let personal preference or aesthetics or modern politics or improvised spirituality, define our future. Not when the literal survival of our folk is at stake. And we all watch the news and we all see what's going on. This is not the Frithstead's not about, you know, politics, but at the same time, we don't need to be blind to the realities. So, so I'll just leave that there and move on, because I want to ask, where does this leave us? And ultimately, it leaves us with the humbling process of unlearning and relearning. Now, I know the whole word humbling, that's almost like a dirty word to most people, but it's not being humble in the sense of weakness, but just in humble in the sense of being mature enough to say, okay, I was wrong, I need to learn, and or maybe I was immature, I need to grow up, because it really, what's the alternative of not growing our faith? It literally is disappearing, and that's unacceptable to me, period. But that humbling process, that part is hard, and it's hard because it means admitting that some of what we believed and what we defended and or what we became attached to was wrong, or at least incomplete, let's say. Okay, because there's all varying degrees. um, it means setting aside the habits, the assumptions, the setting aside the pop cultural nonsense that this of this modern world, and you know trading it in favor of something older and deeper and truer. But our pride doesn't like that. Ego doesn't like that. But standing in truth is still better than sinking in lies. It is, think of it like this, okay? Rebuilding a house, right? If the foundation is cracked and sinking, you don't just keep adding rooms. No, you tear it down, you dig back to solid ground, and then you rebuild it properly. And that is what the work is. It's not inventing a new religion. It's not dressing up modern ideas in old language, but it's rebuilding on the strongest foundations that we can recover, right? And that means rigorous research. It means archaeology, language studies, historical record, comparative study, and the lore itself, approached with a approached with reverence and in a discipline, and handled with a proper methodology. It it means refusing to treat our faith like a hobby, or like a just a cool tattoo idea. You know, no longer saying that heathenry isn't a religion, it's just a way of life. Because in truth, it's both. It is a religion and it's a way of life. It's external and it's internal. You know, we are not here just to play dress up, LARPing like our ancestors. We're here to learn from them. You see, modernity teaches people to think that faith is mainly private, that it's just a personal feeling of, or a private comfort, a matter of individual taste, preference, right? But our faith was never meant to be reduced to that. Our faith is communal, and our faith is inherited, and it's bound up with peoplehood, duty, and continuity. So we have to ask ourselves a very difficult question, you know, and it's asking ourselves, and we have to be truthful with ourselves. Does my way strengthen the greater way, or does my way hinder it? You see, when personal preference, tribal vanity, or just like private personal feelings, attachment, subjective attachment, when it starts creating division, then something has gone wrong. And this is one of those moments where the common good must come before self-interest. There's a German saying, Gemeinnützigkeit for Eigennutz, which is basically saying the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And the distinction has to be made, or the point rather, that this does not erase the individual, but it puts the individual back in right relation back with the whole. Okay. Now, a big part of this unlearning is moral. Modern society tells us that right and wrong are subjective, that morality is basically whatever feels good, whatever is convenient, um, whatever harms nothing according to the standards of the moment. All right. But that ultimately is moral rot. That's hedonism just dressed up as freedom. Now, in Sedianism, our lives are guided by sacred law that's handed down by the gods and embodied in the customs of our people. And these laws are not suggestions, they are our compass. They orientate us, point us in the direction that we need to go. They face us north. They orient us towards honor, integrity, discipline, understanding, wisdom. Now, when we follow those thews, that is, a thew being behavioral guidelines, teaching us, showing us how to live, how to be, but yet rooted in our sacred order. When we follow these, we're not merely being good in some vague modern sense, but we're aligning ourselves with the will of the gods and with the cosmic order itself. And this is why ritual matters, because we don't perform rituals for show. We don't do them for aesthetics, even though aesthetics are nice and it appeals to our emotions. So I'm not against aesthetics when it comes to I'm not against having good aesthetics and flashy aesthetics in ritual, but those are tools, those are aids, but that's not ultimately what we're there for. Because we are a part of the web of weird that is fate, and our actions matter. We're there for the ritual itself. That's the main thing. Now, let's talk about blood memory. All right. Because people throw that phrase around without always explaining what they mean. And in our tradition, you're not just a random individual who appeared out of nowhere. You are part of an ancestral line, and you carry, the hemingia, that is the luck, force, and of the inheritance that you have from all of those who came before you. And that matters. It means that your soul is not detached from your folk. It means your life is not spiritually self-contained, by itself. You are not an isolated little box. um, you are bound to those before you, and you are responsible to those who come after you. So when I say that our religion is a lifeline, I mean it literally. It is the means by which that ancestral connection is awakened, but it is ordered, and it's carried forward. And one of the reasons unlearning matters is because modern distractions, they fill our heads with so much trash that we just become numb, and we no longer feel what's there. But to strip away enough of the noise, you begin to when you know when you strip away enough of the noise, you begin to heal, and then you begin to feel that pulse of that inheritance again. And now this, brings us right back to unity. Some people, they wonder, why do we need a broader setish unity? Why do we need a broader setish identity? Um, why can't we just continue to all just, whatever, do our own thing? And then, that's the, rugged American individualism that all of us in America are indoctrinated in. But let's see, how should I word this? Okay, generally the people who push for that and are asking those questions, they want to remain locked within the separated tribal labels, if you will, the fragmented camps, or remain in highly, hyper individualized forms of, personal devotion, going back to, the mentality that we have of, the personal relationship, with the quote unquote creator. A lot of that uh, bleeds over, and people don't even realize where they're getting that from. But history, it tells a different story, because unity is not just some modern invention that's being forced onto the faith, and it's one of the reasons that our people even survived at all, because they held and they fought for a degree of unity, right? um, Now, of course, I know unity taken too far is a very bad thing, but what I'm talking about, and I'll get there and I'll explain, but it's not to be taken too far. And so it must be taken within the context of the point I'm trying to make, and hopefully it'll be clear, or it is clear. But okay, think of it like the ancestral stream. Think of our ancestral stream, right? And it's not just a single narrow creek, but it's a great river that's fed by many other branches. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, all different but closely related tribes, came together and became the English. Other Germanic and kindred peoples merged, adapted, and endured across time and place. In the New World, um, in America, various European branches came together and formed new communal identities without ceasing to be descended from what they were, you know, and in this sense, like what I'm talking about, that's not weakness. That's called survival. And that is continuity under changed conditions. So when I speak of Sedish belief, I'm not asking anyone to deny the tribal lines that shaped them. What I'm saying is that we must draw strength from the full inheritance of the greater Germanic stream. Anglo-Saxon, Norse, Continental Germanic, um, these closely related peoples of the same family. You know, these are branches of a larger inheritance. And if we share the same broad civilizational ancestral foundation, then merging together uh, definitely makes us stronger, and it does not destroy us. It preserves us. And this is the heart of the Sedish worldview of what Sedianism is. It's one faith, but many expressions. You know, so yeah, let's get into the many expressions thing to just for some clarification, right? So privately in your home, in your hearth cult, in your local fellowship, um, or some say kindred, uh, you may emphasize a particular line that most strongly calls to you. Like for instance, you may feel especially bound to the Anglo-Saxon way, or you might say, "Well, I feel the pull of the Norse," or if you're German, you know, go that route because there's definitely different cultural expressions, and there is nothing inherently wrong with that, but now that's privately, right? Or with your own groups. But publicly, nationally, organizationally, civilizationally, we can no longer afford fragmentation. We can't sit here and go, well, I'm Anglo-Saxon, but you're Norse, so we're completely separate. That's infighting. That's like, you know, two siblings that are wanting to fight each other and arguing that they're not family. And that doesn't make any sense. That just hurts us. It hurts everybody, you know. But so what I'm saying is when we step into the public square, when we build institutions, when we defend our faith, when we seek legitimacy, when we fight for the future of our people, of all our people, then it really is important that we stand under a broader banner. And I'm putting it out there right now that that banner is Setianism. But this doesn't erase difference. It orders difference, and it gives um, private distinction a public shield wall, if you will. Because if we do not do this, then we remain a scattered collection of small groups drifting apart, and each too weak to hold the line. But if we stand together, we embody the full strength of our inheritance, and we become more than just the isolated fragments. We become a people that have form, a people that have a strong memory, and especially a people that have a direction. They know where they came from and they know where they're going, and they march forward with strength and with determination and with a plan. Plan means everything. Excuse me. But okay, this is not this is not about pretending that everyone thinks exactly alike, because we don't want that. We don't want echo chambers. That's not good. It's about having a shared foundation of belief, a shared purpose, and loyalty to one another. And that doesn't mean loyalty as in we're all going to be friends with each other, because that's unrealistic. There'll be people that are of the exact same faith as us, and we may look at that person and be like, I can't stand you. But but by having the shared foundation of the faith, unity in that, then when there are things that need to be fought for, we can put aside those personal differences and have an ally to fight by our side. That's thinking of that's putting the folk first, not putting ourselves first. Now, okay, I know some people will hear all this talk about merging traditions and unity, and they're still might miss the point and immediately cry syncretism or universalism. Um, Hopefully, you haven't got that point with what I've been talking about, because that is not what I'm advocating, you know. But I'll let me just try to clarify just in case. Okay. Um, what is syncretism? It's the blending of different religions. It's mixing, the native faith with outside theological systems and outside traditions that are unrelated traditions, more like it, you know, and but that is not what I'm talking about. Okay, and universalism is not what I'm talking about either. I'm not speaking of a global open house where every path is equally ours, because it certainly is not. What I'm describing is more like a reunion. Okay, it's like uh, grafting back together, the broken branches, that's from the same Germanic tree, but grafting them back into a single, stronger trunk. And it's a unity within a shared ancestral and civilizational inheritance. It belongs to our folk and our folk alone. So so no, standing under one public banner does not erase our personal differences or our tribal differences, but it ultimately protects them, and it protects us, and it gives those differences, the strength to endure. Now, how serious are we about repairing, what was broken? Because we need to realize that we can't repair what was broken. We can't reforge that chain on instinct alone. We can't do it with vibes, with feelings, or vague spirituality. We need an anchor, something solid, right? We need structure. We need a body of teaching that preserves what we have recovered, and we need that anchor to give us a standard from which we build from, right? And this is why we have the main, if you will, the main, Sedian corpus, uh, the upcoming Alderunar, the Abenrunar, books 1 and 2, and the Abenluger. Now, these, there's more excellent, material out there, but when you look at the the pillars of lore and ritual and law, these three pillars that make up what a religion, the bones of a religion, these books contain all of the bones, that they contain the foundation that we can build upon, right? They're so so in that sense, these books are not just there to sit on a shelf or just to read, but they're sacred texts. And sacred text in the sense that I use that particular term, sacred text, okay? Which, like a sacred text, it's a writing that's treated with, the utmost seriousness and reverence, but it's not necessarily claimed as infallible, and it's not claimed as being directly dictated by divine revelation. You know, that's the distinction that I make between what's called a holy text and a sacred text. Like when someone says holy text, that's generally, regarded as like divinely set apart, like scriptural in the strongest sense. Whereas a sacred text is still deeply authoritative and revered, but it's not necessarily understood in the same way, right? So hopefully that's clear, you know. But what purpose does having sacred texts serve? And they serve a lot. And when you really break it down and you look at the need for sacred texts and what do they serve, it's a lot, and they're so important, you know. Like, for one, they preserve our way. They hold our core ideas, our views of life, our morality, how we worship, um, the information that we have of the gods themselves. And being it contains all this, that gives us something tangible that we can hand down without the fear of constant distortion. Because if everything is just strictly word of mouth, it's going to get changed so much. It'd be like the telephone game, you know. um, but they also they provide a moral compass, right? Because in the, like I saying, in this postmodern world that has just lost its sense of right and wrong, sacred texts help anchor right or wrong, right and wrong, and it anchors it into something older and higher than any modern ideas that might be the current whatever. They show the world that this faith is not just a disorganized collection of impulses, but that it's a serious religion, that it has coherence and memory and staying power. And that matters not only for apologetics, which is very important, but it provides legal protection. It provides public recognition and the practical defense of religious freedom. You know, we're not merely inheritors, right? We're more than just those who inherit the faith. We are transmitters. Everything we do now matters. Every ritual performed with precision, every act of honor when dishonor would be easier. Every time we choose unity over vanity, every time we preserve, every time we preserve our faith rather than allow our personal opinions or feelings to distort the faith. All of these things, we are deciding what our descendants will receive. And that's the burden of living, if you will. We are the link. We are the generation standing in the breach, deciding whether the chain will remain broken or whether it will be forged again in our time. And yes, that responsibility is heavy, but good. It should be, because anything worth preserving is worth fighting for. It's through struggle that we gain strength. And that's just the way it is. But the time for guesswork is over. The time for distraction, fragmentation, and modern confusion, it's over. The time for half measures is over. We must rise as one folk, bound by a shared purpose and guided by a sacred order that's anchored in the inheritance of our ancestors. We must honor the gods who guide us, the ancestors who carried what they could. And we must honor the descendants who will live with what we leave behind. We hold fast to what is true. We do the work, we learn, we rebuild, we stand together. And if we do that whole, disciplined, and unbroken, then our folk will not merely survive, we will endure and we will prevail. The gods stand with us, and our ancestors are watching, and the moment is here, and now is the time. And To some degree, you could look at everything that I'm talking about tonight with, in the unity of Sedish belief as being like a tangent uh, from the past several episodes. But in a way, you can look at it like the past several episodes is my attempt to impart truth in order to make you better, make you stronger, so that you can join this fight and together we can help our folk, help our families, and be the best that we could be.